We are very grateful to our sponsor this evening. More Able Than This is sponsored by the Music Department at Georgia College and State University. In addition to bachelor's degrees in music and in music therapy, including a BA plus MAT path to initial music teacher certification, GCSU offers an online master's degree in music education for certified teachers seeking to improve or expand their knowledge and skills, as well as a hybrid Master of Arts in Teaching degree for those seeking initial teacher certification in Georgia. We accept certified and licensed teachers from across the U.S., and Georgia certification is reciprocal with most other states. So don't let state boundaries deter you from applying. Apply now to start in summer or fall 2025. For more information about these degree programs, contact me at tina.holmes-davis@gcsu.edu. That's tina.holmes-davis@gcsu.edu. Welcome to More Able Than This, the podcast where we discuss everything related to disability and music education. More Able Than This is sponsored by the Music Department at Georgia College and State University, Georgia's designated public liberal arts university. Today we'll be talking about accessible vocal instruction with our special guest, Dr. Anne Slovin. Dr. Slovin has been a studio voice and voice science professor at the University of Notre Dame since 2023. She will be joining the voice faculty at UGA in August. So she completed her doctoral work at Indiana University this week. Her dissertation topic was on creating a model for disability-informed voice pedagogy class. So Dr. Slovin, start with telling us about this class and your disability or dissertation research.
Sure, I will. It sounds wild to hear Dr. Slovin, but I'm just going to let us say it over and over again.
I'm going to say it as often as possible.
Great. I defended it on Tuesday, so it's very fresh. So basically where this came from is that I taught voice pedagogy for the first time, and that's the science of teaching the voice, teaching singing. I taught that for the first time in fall 2020 on Zoom, like deep pandemic, nobody's leaving their home. We really didn't know anything at the time, but we were hearing a lot about long COVID already, and about people who had gotten sick in the spring and were now experiencing sort of debilitating, disabling symptoms. And I am currently able-bodied and had not thought about this very much, but it got me realizing as I was putting my first syllabus together that I had never really heard disability talked about in a voice pedagogy curriculum. And as I started to look at my textbooks, I was finding that, for all the best intentions, truly, disability didn't come up, and at times the language around how we talk about the body for singing, vocal health in particular, is an interesting area. But some of that stuff is just downright ableist without really meaning to be. And so I started to think about, well, how could I sort of float this idea into my classes just to see how my students react? And so I didn't really get there until I started teaching in person the year after that. But in my first class in person, I just dropped right into the unit on posture and alignment. Here are some singers who have sort of different kinds of postures, and here's Ali Stroker, who sings in a wheelchair, and Thomas Kvastov, who had significant birth defects and had this incredible career. And we talked about, how would you talk about alignment for singing with someone who can't, stand on the ground with 2 feet, ankles, knees, hips, all that stuff. And I had a couple of students come to me afterwards and say they were just gobsmacked that someone had brought this up in class. And it really interested me because it's such a physical thing that we do. And as a musician, it's so physical. It's all about the body, and singing even more perhaps than other instruments because it's in our body. So you'd think that in a pedagogy that's all about motor learning and training the body to do something that we can't see and all that we would be thinking about all the ways that our bodies are different. But what we're really teaching in the way that the class has normally been taught is sort of this normative default kind of body, which you do have to know. We're not doctors, obviously, and medicalizing voice pedagogy is a whole other story. But it's similar to how, a doctor needs to know the sort of nuts and bolts of how the body is put together, and on the understanding that everybody they see is going to be a little different than that, and that people are going to come in with anomalies and things that are wrong or not working the way that the book says they should work. And it's the same for us, is that we need to learn the nuts and bolts and the anatomy and physiology of how it's put together, the larynx and the breath mechanism and all that. But then we need to be understanding and teaching our students that really what they're going to encounter is this radical diversity of bodies. We're not going to encounter this works for everybody all the time, because it never does. Rarely does. No, not at all. So that was kind of where I started. I got a really strong reaction. And I wrote the first version of this paper for a pedagogy class in my doctoral coursework in 2021. Yeah, the same time I was floating all of this in my syllabus. And then I started presenting a little bit and got some great feedback and decided to expand it into my dissertation. And that is sort of where we're at now.
I'm so excited. I remember when you and I met at the One-Handed Musical Instrument Conference in Birmingham this March. You were talking about how, we were talking about adapting instruments.
Right.
And you were talking about how, since we can't adapt the body, once the body is set, that's the way it is. You have to adapt the pedagogy.
Right. Exactly. You have to adapt, and you have to really make the student's experience of their own body a big part of it. I think with adaptive instruments, you have to do that as well. Is like, how does your body work? How do your hands and feet, or whatever the case may be, how's that going to work to play this instrument? But for us, it's so internal. And as teachers, we spend a lot of time talking about sensations that are not real. Sometimes what you feel is not anatomically what's happening. I had a professor once call those helpful lies, because they get you to do what we want you to do, but it's not true. It's like a little bit of a model for what's happening. But we talk so much about, you're gonna feel XYZ. What does it feel like? But we just can't know anybody else's experience of being in their own body. So we need to be asking these questions of our students of like, how does your body work? How do you understand that in your own body? And truly, that's disabled or able-bodied or anyone. We should be asking those questions.
So how has that worked in your experience? Do you find that people are able to articulate what it feels like?
Yeah, there's a range, actually. And sometimes it takes a little exploration for them to be able to say, oh, I feel XYZ, I feel the sound vibrating in this part of my face, this is what I feel when I breathe. We're not all very clued into our bodies. I know when I was 17 to 21 and went to college, I was singing from like here up. I was really not aware of the rest of my body. And so I think if someone had asked me, and maybe they did, my apologies to my teachers, but I don't remember. I'm sure when my teachers asked me, what do you feel? Or how does that feel to you? It really didn't. I wasn't able to tell them. So some people are really hooked in and really able to say, well, when I bend my knees a little bit more like that, I get this sound. I often go for, we say a lot of how do you feel, but sometimes I'll think about, how was that different? So if we're doing exercises and I ask them to make a physical change, like for example, bending your knees, we do it a lot. Assuming that a student is able to do that, it often helps them to get grounded and to get more sort of muscular support. But often I'll have them, they'll do an exercise and I'll say, what would be helpful, I think, is if you bend your knees. And they do it, and I have them do it a couple more times to sort of observe what's going on. And then I say, how was that different from before? And then what did you do? what did you do to get there? Because what they did to get there and what they had to think about may not be the same as what I have had to think about. So, and I will say also, like, the first time that I did some of this with my current students, it was really challenging. But by the end, I've had some students who have been with me for 2 years. And by the end of 2 years, they're all, like, ready. They're ready to answer the questions. And so they really take ownership, I think, of their own technique and their own learning. And it means that we tailor a technique to each individual person. It's really cool.
Yeah, and I think it'll be easier when you're going into it as an established person doing this.
Oh, yeah.
Because when it was weird to you and it was weird to them,
yeah,
that was one vibe. But when it's weird to them but not weird to you, that's going to be a different vibe.
Oh, absolutely. Last year was a really challenging starting brand new and trying to bring in some of these ideas. But yeah, I've really found that just thinking towards this idea that every singing body is different and feels different and comes at things differently. Our minds are different too. It has been really helpful with all students. And I have had some experiences where asking just the right question or noticing just the right thing has gotten us a little bit deeper into a student's experience. I had a wonderful sophomore last year who then changed her major, or rather dropped her music major because she was amazing and had 3 majors, and she needed something had to give. She's wonderful. In case she listens to this, Madeline, you're great. But she was holding a lot of tension kind of in her breath area, in her rib cage, and I was noticing some movement there, and I said, I'm noticing that. What are you feeling? And she said, oh, I have scoliosis. And she was correcting, not because I had told her to, but she had danced in high school, and she was sort of straightening up her back, but her natural posture was kind of more curved because of the scoliosis. And the second she kind of released it and went with what her body does instead of trying to overcome something or turn it into something that looked more like the book, a lot of the things we had been working on resolved themselves because there was this tension that was being added. So it took a year. It took a solid most of the year to kind of get to that place of disclosure. But once she did, it was pretty amazing to then see her find, oh, these are my sensations. This is what I need to do. That's different than what other people need to do.
Yeah, sometimes as teachers, it's hard for us to break out of the normal mode.
Oh, yeah.
I remember a few years ago, after I was already playing the one-hand... Sorry, my dog's coming to say hello.
No problem.
I was already playing the one-handed clarinet, and I was playing duets with the clarinet instructor at Georgia College. And so she was the clarinet professor, and I was just playing duets. So I very much was, waiting for her to take the lead. And we stood there, and I said, what are we waiting on? She said, I'm waiting for you to get your hands in position. And I was like, baby, my hands are in position.
I'm ready.
That one, the one, and, it was hard for her as a teacher to deal with me in a body position that wasn't the standard body position. Just because she had never done it before.
Yeah.
And, we didn't have any problem. There was no bias. It was just awkward for her because she, for however many years, has been playing with people who look like this.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I'll tell you, when I went to the OMI conference, that's one-handed musical instruments, I saw people playing instruments in ways that I had never seen before, and I was blown away. And I know what's so interesting is that I know that every singer sings differently and approaches singing differently, but I hadn't really thought, and I'll tell you, it took me a minute to realize what OMI stood for. And then I arrived and I was like, got it. Because the conference was about just physical disability and music. It wasn't specifically about this, but I got there and I was blown away. And just looking at the way that people adapt and play instruments in different ways, that no one's ever seen. It's really amazing.
I get tired as a disabled person of people telling me I'm an inspiration. But I called my husband and I said, now I know why able people that find this so inspiring.
Yeah.
After watching some of our peers, yeah.
Yeah. It was mostly like just the working with, it's not that anybody, I know that there's that language of like overcoming something, overcoming adversity to, you know, to play music, and there is a little bit of that, but at the same time, what's inspiring to me is the looking at exactly who the person is, what their body is able to do, and saying, yeah, you can play the cello.
Yeah, work with your toes.
With your toes! I don't know what it would take to get toe independence like that, but that was one of the most incredible things I've ever seen. And not even because these are disabled players, just because it's an incredible feat. No pun intended. Sorry.
There's a horn player named Thomas Gleiser. He's German, and he was born without arms. So as a child, he would sit on the floor, and I don't remember, and I don't know that he has disclosed, or he may not remember why he chose the horn, but he sits on the floor and he plays the horn with independent toes, which isn't the remarkable thing. He sits in this position with his feet up because now the horn has to be on a stand so that he can reach the mouthpiece, and you cannot hear that bend in his breath, mechanism. And then the other thing is horn players. I'm sorry. Horn players put. I think I may be doing this backwards. I think they put the left hand in the bell to adjust intonation. He must do all of it with his embouchure and air because he does not have that other foot in the bell. So, but yeah, if you listen to him play, he's got one of the prettiest. Oh, she's got a toy. Okay, sorry. He's got one of the prettiest horn tones, just very, very light, beautiful horn tone. And if he plays out of tune, I haven't heard him do it.
Oh, that's amazing. But
he plays.
That's so wild. That's so cool.
Yeah, the toe independence is one thing, but the thing is he is squished up. I always taught my band students when I was a middle school band teacher that it's like a flexi straw.
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah.
And you want it to be straight until the flex.
We talk about that a lot, too, about not crunching.
His flexi straw is not straight.
People, I think the body figures it out. If that's what you need to do, it adapts and it learns. It's all motor learning and motor skills. And I think, probably the first time he did it, it was really awful. And it was really hard.
As a child.
Right.
Yeah. So he grew up with it.
Yeah. In that case, by now, his body is just adapted to do that, I think.
That's just what we do.
Yeah. And I just watching people play those adaptive instruments, I was just like, oh, this is what we do all the time, except you can't see the instrument. Like every single person operates differently and you can't see the instrument, and it's really interesting. Something that fascinated me being there was that a couple of our colleagues told me that when their children were trying to get into music lessons, and they were the ones who played the cello with their feet, they were told, oh, well, she could just sing. And they were astonished to learn that we have our own set of issues. We have our own set of conventions. We have a lot of, like, the best posture for singing is standing. And you have to align your body a certain way and breathe like this and resonate the voice like this. And also a lot of exclusion. There's not a lot of visibly disabled singers on the opera stage. Starting to be more in musical theater, but still really not enough. And it makes it very difficult for disabled singers, especially young ones, to envision themselves kind of continuing. So that's one of my big concerns, is looking at that pipeline. And I looked mostly at college because we don't really teach voice pedagogy earlier than college.
Because it's not ready yet.
Well, we do teach like voice lessons, and I think there's a lot that younger students can learn, but the class itself isn't something you get until college. But one of my my amazing committee members actually asked, she said, we don't see disabled singers auditioning. And this is IU, Jacobs School of Music. It's very, very, top. And she said, it's not that we don't want them, but I feel like we don't get visibly disabled singers. We don't we don't seem to get them. And I said, honestly, I think a lot of it is because they self-select away when they realize that there doesn't seem to be a place for them on stage. And I think we can do a lot with this kind of curriculum and representation to really show that, like, you know, there's a place for them. There's a place for us, right?
The second guest I had, so it was episode 2 in this podcast, is a singer with cerebral palsy. And she actually did her doctorate, and don't let me say, I think Ball State.
Oh, Ball State. I'm sending a student there in the fall. That's so great.
I may be wrong, but off the top of my head, I'm thinking. So anyway, she all the way through her graduate studies and stuff, she wanted to sing opera. She's a mezzo, a very heavy mezzo. But, you know, she had trouble with some of the opera producers because they wouldn't cast her in roles because they were afraid she'd fall. But then she had a few very creative, and you can go back and listen to episode 2.
Oh, I will, yeah.
And, you know, she got cast in some roles where her cane was appropriate, either because the role was for someone who uses a cane, or I think in one place she actually wielded her cane like it was a wand of some sort.
Perfect.
And so, yeah, but that's, you know, that's one thing, you know, people aren't being cast because of their, you know, their visible disabilities.
Yeah. And it's also, it's one thing if you're established, right? There's a few people that I bring up in my paper. One of the most famous examples of recent years is Joyce DiDonato was in Barber of Seville in London. She is, as far as I'm aware, able-bodied at the moment, but she broke her ankle while rehearsing. I don't know, workman's comp question there. I don't know. She might have just fallen on the street and broken her ankle. And initially they were going to like have her sing from the pit and have somebody else walk the role, and in the end they got her like a little athletic wheelchair, because also she mentions in a video on YouTube that the wings were not wide enough for like a full-size wheelchair, so they had to get her like a little collapsible one. And she was ambulatory, you know, she just had a cast on and she used crutches for some of it, but they basically improvised that whole night's show. Like, they didn't have time to rehearse, they just threw her up there in a wheelchair, and the whole cast went with it. The wheelchair became part of it, and it's so cool. And there's clips of it on YouTube. It's so cool. But to this day, you know, people, you post that video. I mean, not me, because my friends know what my topic is. But if you see it posted publicly in other places, the comments are like, Rosina doesn't have a disability. Rosina's not in a wheelchair. And I'm like, says who? And there's a great opera singer. There's a Canadian opera company called Opera Mariposa that is a disability-forward opera company. And it's run by Jacqueline Coe and Robin Hahn. And Robin Hahn uses a cane, and she has sparkly ones. I don't know how many she has. But she talks a lot about mobility aids in opera and the fact that people have used mobility aids in life for as long as people have existed one way or another, you know. And so it isn't inaccurate or anachronistic or anything like that for a character to use a cane.
It's life.
It's life. It's life. And then I went to see the musical Suffs. I don't know if you had an opportunity to see it, but I think there's gonna be a pro shot on TV somewhere. So I hope you get to see it there. But there was a woman in a wheelchair in the ensemble. It's about the suffragist movement, and it's like, of course there would have been disabled suffragists, plenty, yeah. And now that actress is playing Nessa Rose in Wicked on Broadway, and she's the first disabled person to actually play that role. So, you know, finding places where it's like, it's not even a thing, it's not even a big deal. And another story that I really like, I'm just going to tell you all my story is from history. But Marjorie Lawrence is one of my favorite historical figures in opera, because I think we think of this advocacy and this idea of sort of disability creativity, to borrow a term from Greg Mumji from Opera Practicos in New York. We think of this as a new phenomenon. We think of disability studies as like recent, you know, and it kind of is, you know, these models and this way of thinking about things is more recent. But in 1941, so Marjorie Lawrence was a Wagnerian soprano. She rode a horse on stage. She was very famous for that. She was like super athletic. She was Australian, and she contracted polio in 1941. And she was paralyzed from the waist down. Nobody knew if she was going to sing again. She didn't know if she was going to sing again. And it became clear that she would be able to sing, that her diaphragm hadn't been impacted. She couldn't walk, but she had the strength, the upper body strength, to be able to sing Wagner, which is pretty amazing. And the Met, they initially were kind of concerned that people were going to come see, if they cast her, people were going to come see it out of pity. That was what the Met said. And I was like, butts in seats, guys. Butts in seats. But they eventually were like, we love, she's wonderful, she's popular. It'll be a comeback. People will be really happy to come see her do this. So they created, first she played Venus in Tannhäuser, which wouldn't have originally been her role, but they decided that Elizabeth was too active and needed to stride around. I don't know. But Venus could lounge on a thing. You can lounge on your half shell or whatever. And so she played Venus, which is a mezzo role. And they brought her out, and she lounged on the set and sang gloriously, and everyone moved around her. And then she sang her first Isolde, in Tristan und Isolde. And it was the same idea, where the staging was built for her. It was built around her. And so and the reviews were rapturous. You can go into the Wayback Machine on NewYorkTimes.com and read what they said about it. And people were like, she sounds incredible. Who cares? And
it's not going to be...
No. What were you going to say? Sorry.
It's not going to be normal until we do it.
Exactly.
Who would have imagined an all black and brown cast for the musical Hamilton until we did it?
Right. We had, 1776 in the 60s, all white people.
Yeah, we've just got to do it.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And as Janine Tesori said at the Tony Awards, you have to see it to be it. And so somebody has to do it first. And I just hope that, we can get a little bit more momentum on this.
That's what Julie Duty, who is the creator of the organization United Sound, which is designed to bring in students with disability into band and orchestra settings. And she said at first it does kind of become inspiration porn, where the audience comes to see the poor little children play the instruments. But she said after a couple of years, that's what we do to get started, but after a couple of years they become very valued members of the school population.
Absolutely.
And the music program. So if that's the door that gets us in, then that's the one we're going to use.
No, I love that. I wanted to go back to something you were saying about your previous guest, where the directors were afraid she was going to fall. Because as part of my paper, I did a lot of interviews. I did some ethnographic work. Because I'm not disabled at the moment, I wanted to speak to people who are and have those voices in my paper. And I would love to go further with that actually in the future. But everyone I talked to had a story or had the fear of that kind of thing happening, of not getting a job or having a job taken away, or a piece of staging, something they're supposed to do in the show getting taken away because somebody else was worried about them. And everyone said that body autonomy was the big thing, that they all wanted to...
let me fall. Yeah.
Right. Let me figure it out. Let me decide what I'm capable of. And I spoke to people who... a couple of my respondents were disability advocates, and so when you Google them, they were not anonymized, because when you Google them, it's everywhere. It's these are people you should know. Also, they're fabulous.
Outstanding.
But
are they on my sheet?
I don't think they are yet, but I did include them in the email.
All right. Yeah. Hopefully, we're adding more each day.
Good. Excellent. But I had a couple people say, want to stay fully anonymous because
it's dangerous.
It's dangerous, and if you're working in the opera industry, it's hard to prove. It's illegal, but it's hard to prove that that's why you weren't hired again, or that's why you were let go from something, or told not to come to a program, or whatever the case may be. And one of my respondents said, I want to be the one to make the decisions about what I'm capable of. If I audition for a show, I am telling you that I am capable of doing that. And part of the challenge is that we tend to design productions before we cast people. And then it's like, we just have to cast the people who are like the most able-bodied, who can do all the things just in case, you know, rather than adjusting the staging a little bit.
But contrary to popular belief, we don't want to fall.
Right.
We don't want to get hurt. So we're going to monitor and kind of self-monitor so that when we get into a situation we say, okay, I can go to here,
Right.
but I can't go there.
Yeah, and one of my respondents, his name is David Salisbury Fry, and he's written quite a lot about this. He's a hemophiliac and a base, and he's been very open for the last decade or so about his disability and his experiences. But he was in a production of Shostakovich's The Nose at Chicago Opera Theater. This is a good story. And he said the whole cast was chosen very specifically because of who they were and their identities, and they wanted it to be as diverse as possible. And they each met individually with the director before staging started, just to, give her the scoop on them and what they needed and their boundaries. And David was telling me there was a scene where the whole chorus was jumping, and he has some joint stiffness and he's only able to jump so far, and the director said, can we get more height on that? And because they had established this method of working that was built on the specific needs of the performers, he was able to say, no, I'm sorry, I can't. And that was the end of the discussion, and she said, okay, give us what you can give us. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I see that happening. I'm like, if they can do it here, we can do it everywhere. It shouldn't be an issue, but I think there's a lot of worry about that, and a lot of liability concerns in opera.
There is, and then there's a lot of just, this is the look we want.
Yeah. Oh. Mm-hmm.
But although, when Bonnie and I, Bonnie's the mezzo.
Yeah.
When she and I were presenting at the National Opera Association convention, 2018, 19, somewhere in there, there was one of her former mentors had programmed a blind singer in the role of the Queen of the Night.
Sure.
And what they did was they just completely masked her. Yes. So nobody knew if she was blind or not because she was masked, and her understudy was the handmaiden.
Oh.
And so the idea was that the handmaiden walked her out and did all the stuff, but it was also practical, and that if something happened, she would just immediately pick up the role.
That's so great and cool, because like a Queen of the Night with no face, where you can't see, or you can see the mouth, but like that's scary, like in a dramatic good way. Like that's what a cool idea. Anyway.
But I also, I like the fact that he built in his backup.
Yeah.
He trusted the blind singer to do her job, but he also, because maybe he wasn't 100% comfortable with it, or maybe we weren't 100% comfortable, he built in his backup who was right there. Mm-hmm. And so his staging allowed that understudy to be right there and ready to, to fill in immediately.
Yeah. Well, I do also wonder, obviously I can't speak for any other singers, but I do also wonder if having somebody there makes the singer feel more secure, like knowing, because then you can really do your job. If you are safe and you are cared for in one way or another, and I don't know who decided that there would be another person there, but maybe it took the pressure off the singer to that she just got to think about her high notes, right? And she would know that, like, if anything happened, there was somebody there to guide her or catch her or whatever needed to happen. But that's so interesting. There's so many different ways to do it, and there's so many different. I mean, if you look at like Regie-Theater in Germany, people do all kinds of outrageous things with opera, and this is not that outrageous. Like, it's just what human beings are like. We have so much diversity and so many different ways of functioning.
That's the way I teach my pre-service teachers about disability. I call it the full range of being human.
Yeah.
Because it's not necessarily, I saw an interesting, and I haven't done the reading to back this up, but it was an interesting perspective on ADHD recently. They said that ADHD isn't a disability; it's just a different way of being. And they said it harkens back to our ancestors who were hunter
Oh,
gatherers,
sure.
and they had to be hyper aware and hyper alert to do what they did. And so those skills were very necessary then, but now that we're sitting 8 hours a day, those same skills become a disability.
Right. Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, I haven't done the research, but that was an amazing perspective to me.
Yeah, actually, my friend Rayleigh Gold at IU is working on her dissertation about ADHD and autism in the voice studio. So stay tuned.
Outstanding.
Stay tuned.
Yes.
That'll be coming. I think she's got some really exciting research
And
on
y'all
that.
are building, sorry, y'all are building an open access resource called Disability and Accessibility in the Voice Studio.
Yes, we are. We are. So this is the brainchild of my colleague at Bowling Green State University, Kathy Mizell. She's an ethnomusicologist, and she actually co-authored with Maria Georgia Kakaru, who is also a blind singer and has been doing research about teaching the blind and visually impaired. And they co-authored a chapter for the Oxford Handbook of Voice Pedagogy, I think, about with the same title, kind of on this topic. But what we really needed was a wide variety of research of people looking at very specific things, people talking about the opera industry and musical theater and different kinds of disabilities, chronic illness, ADHD, universal design, all kinds of things. So yeah, so we have, I keep meaning to count how many contributors we actually have. I'm going to go with 15 altogether, something like that. And Kathy and I met actually at a Performance Studies Institute at Northwestern. It was all about the voice and different ways of thinking about the voice. And she reached out to me and said, oh my gosh, we have this overlap. And we ended up working together, which is so great. And so we're co-editors, and we just have so many interesting topics, and our goal is to pilot it at Bowling Green. So the pedagogy professors there have offered to sort of incorporate it into their curriculum for the fall, I think is what we're hoping. Yeah, and then it'll be available for free, open access to anybody, and we're hoping to sort of keep it open and get more funding so that we can add to it in the future, because really every time I turn around there's like new research. I was saying in my defense on Tuesday, I was like, since I finished this paper in February, there's new research and I'm discovering more things and people who are talking about things that I hadn't made it into my paper. Also, it's 80 to 100 pages for a doctor of music. You can only go so far. But yeah, I'm super excited about that, and it's a big part of my recommendation really for voice pedagogy curriculum, and something I tried to do this year. I taught a 1 hour a week voice pedagogy class this year, which is brutally short. It's really not enough time. So in the future, if I teach this class, I'm hoping to really use the syllabus that I created for my dissertation and go further than I have. But my hope is that alongside a more traditional voice pedagogy textbook, because we still want that, we still want the exercises, we still want an understanding of how the larynx is put together and all that, I'm hoping that people will assign these materials. We have videos, we have essays. Some folks did videos and essays, so there's a little bit of both. And it's not even that things necessarily correlate directly to every single possible unit of voice pedagogy, but it's so crucial to think about this when you're learning how to teach voice, that that's my big recommendation, along with sort of representing disability more generally in the course materials and in your PowerPoints and in the kinds of singers that you show. And yeah, so we're really excited to roll this out. And I'm excited. I just started working on this today. Sorry, Kathy. But I'm taking a section of my dissertation and expanding it as my contribution. And it's about vocal fold injury, like vocal impairment as disability. And I'm looking a little bit, it's just a start, but I'm looking a little bit at what we could do to accommodate vocal fold injury, because that's something I've been through myself and was accommodated pretty significantly, but it's not something that people think of. There's a wonderful professor at Boston Conservatory, Emily Sayre, whose thesis is about student perception of vocal impairment and the stigma around that, so how students deal with it. And she asked them, you know, did you go to the disability service office? Did you go to the office of accessibility at your school? And nobody did, because it's not how we think about it.
And there's still a stigma
There's
around
still a
being
stigma.
disabled.
Yeah, exactly. But so a lot of if there were accommodations, they were made sort of student and teacher, or student and like department chair, and hopefully that goes okay. But Emily said something in her paper about how, you know, disability services folks could you know, go to a seminar about vocal fold injury and impairment and learn kind of what might be required. Because instrumentalists get injured too, you know. But I remember yeah. But I remember but I mean use injuries also.
No, I know. Yeah.
I remember some trumpet players I went to college with who hurt their mouths and had to take a semester off. And the reason I remember that is that they took voice lessons instead of trumpet lessons for a semester.
The former principal of the New York Phil got focal dystonia, dysplasia, something, unable to make a buzz, and had to step away from playing for a few years.
Wow.
As I understand now, he is able to buzz now, but I'm not sure,
Yeah.
you know what. So yeah, that would be an overused injury, I think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But she was mentioning that like some of the disability services offices she spoke to said they'd had instrumentalists in, but not vocalists. And so I think continuing to talk about that, about use injuries and also other things that can happen, muscle tension dysphonia, where you get kind of tightness. There's all kinds of things that can happen, and it's what happens when you use your voice all day, every day. Even if your technique is flawless, nobody's technique is flawless, but you can have the best technique ever and still develop some kind of use injury because of a heavy load or illness. You know, coughing a lot can do it. And so we just have to remove that stigma, I think, and find ways to adjust the requirements if needed so that these students can continue to feel like they belong here and finish their program.
And so is the disability and accessibility in the voice studio something, once the resource is complete, that maybe I could link to this episode so that our listeners could eventually be able to access it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure if it's going to be
after the fall.
No, of course, yeah. I think it would be after that pilot program. But yeah, that's the idea, is that it can really just go forth and be available. We wanted to make sure that it was not gatekept in any way, that we were just sharing freely these resources, because it's really important and fascinating work.
It is. It's important, like we've said several times. You know, we can't get people until they see themselves. So somebody's going to have to take the first step and break. You know, be willing to risk the stigma and do the things. And yeah, so if we can, you know, as teachers get people in, then we might be able to get people in more safely.
100%. And I think also when it comes to voice pedagogy class, it's on the one hand, it's about showing disabled singers that there's a place for them, but also that they can become teachers, because there aren't that many visibly disabled voice teachers at the college level either, because it's so hard to get through all of the degrees that you need. And so I think that's another thing that's gonna, I hope that teaching voice pedagogy in this way will help with, is working on the pipeline from sort of voice lessons down here to college to master's, and then through the doctorate that you need to then get that full-time job and be teaching people. Because if there's no mentors, if there's no disabled mentors, it's very difficult to support disabled students, and we want them to be supported. And so their teachers need to have gone through all of this education. We need to make that easier for them and show them that this is possible, and that we're going to make sure they can do it.
Outside the classroom, there are needs Sometimes it's difficult to work with a disabled colleague because there are needs that we have just on a day-to-day basis that our able colleagues don't have. I know Bonnie, when she worked at Georgia College, she had, she doesn't drive, and so she had some issues with the mass transportation, being able to get her from her home to, to teach, and then be able to walk from where the bus stop is to wherever she needed to go. And, so there are some needs that, when you have somebody who has a disability and they have navigated this whole thing, then they have to be able to live and function in your area.
Absolutely. And it's in the architecture. I read an article, and I'm not going to be able to remember it off the top of my head. I don't even know if it made it into the paper, but I have all these little bits that didn't make it into the dissertation. And this was one of them about how many colleges are really inaccessible. Even if they're sort of trying to make older buildings more accessible or build new buildings, the symbolism there is really designed to keep people out. I mean, almost every college has like a big picture of a great big set of stairs, somewhere. And the parking is very far away if you're able to drive. And then what if you need to, you struggle to get closer, and hopefully there's handicap parking. But like, I think, the way that a lot of the structures are built, especially the older ones, are truly designed to not be accessible. So that's something I think that does need to be worked on as well.
Now, a lot of that, at least in the US, we're talking about the Rehabilitation Act. I think it was 1973 that introduced disabled children into school at all. So we can't get them to college until they were in school, and we're talking about 1973.
Unreal.
We're talking about our lifetime.
It's so recent. So,
yeah. So, all of these is like I was laughing with Dr. Furness at the University of Manchester when we were in UK, because I was like, I teach it at a historical campus. And I was like, my building was built in 1939. And we both kind of chuckled because here we are at the University of Manchester.
Right.
And that would be new there.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, so all of this, a lot of these schools were built before people with disability were ever in society at all.
100%.
And certainly before, there was any expectation of schooling. So it's not even necessarily a gate that was intentionally made.
No, it's not malicious.
That we have to get through. Yeah. So my building that I teach in now has an externally mounted elevator.
Oh, cool.
And so, but the doors are so heavy that wheelchair users couldn't get through anyway, because
and it's like one of those, it's not an automatic door, it's one of those ones that opens.
No, the automatic doors are difficult to upkeep. I was talking to the head of our disability services a year or two ago. He prefers the 5-pound doors. That are, very light to move. Now, I don't know if he's ever been in a wheelchair himself and tried to do doors by himself. But either way, our building just has the big doors. And so I haven't tried to do it in my wheelchair because I try not to use my wheelchair. And I find it, I try not to because I have a pushchair and someone has to take time out of their day to take me. So unless I just can't function, I try to walk. But one of my colleagues injured her foot or her leg a few years ago and was in a chair for a few days. And, I do remember it was difficult for her to get around, even as a temporary wheelchair user. But because it's a historical building there, I find that even with ADA, kind of the least amount of what I have to do to be compliant. So we have an elevator, we have an elevator. What else do you want from us? And it's not even meant to be exclusatory. It's just, they're trying to deal with all of the things. And, we're in that catch-22 of, well, there's not enough of you to make this a priority, but there will never be enough of us because we don't feel welcome.
Right. And that goes back to kind of the feeling of, well, we don't have any disabled students in this department. We don't see a lot of disabled people auditioning or interviewing, at least who are open and visible about it. And you're so right. Like, there won't be unless we show them that this is a hospitable and safe and welcoming place. Yeah.
And that's what I'll go back to Julie Duty from United Sound. She said one of the biggest issues they have is even when they reach out to the parents and say, we want your child, we have this organization, we're going to bring your child in, we're going to learn to play instruments. The parents go, no, my child can't do that, because the only thing they've had for their entire life is my child can't do that. And she said one of the first obstacles they have to get over, excuse me, is convincing the parents that their child can do this.
Wow. Yeah.
But then when they do, of course they can to some level or another. And one of the tenets of United Sound is you play to the point that you can play. So some students are in band orchestra class and they're playing the written music with their peers as it is. And some of them are playing drone notes, whatever
Got it.
they can
Okay.
do, that's what they do.
Yeah. Yeah. Sort of. That's great. That's great. And but it's fascinating that there is that not exactly internalized way of thinking about, preemptively saying, like, my child can't do this. I guess if you've heard it enough times, it really feels like it's true.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because, all you get is the limitations. And, like we were talking about, even with the opera, you're imposing your limitations on me, or your perception of my limitations. And, some of it's right. And sometimes, my brain injury means that my inhibitions, as they, such as they were, which wasn't a lot, are pretty much gone. But on the same token, I hurt enough. I don't want to hurt myself. So I'm not going to put myself in a position where I would intentionally hurt myself. So yeah, in the disabled community, we always say nothing about me without me. But the first thing that happens is, people want to, well-intending, like good people want to make decisions for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the biggest thing I've learned. And I think it's made me a more collaborative teacher. You were asking how it's been put into practice for me. And I think, giving my students the choices, allowing them to make decisions about their own bodies and their own sensations, with me as kind of a guide who does in fact, have some expertise about singing. But it just a little bit, but they are the experts of them, and they get to decide what feels good. And if they tell me this sound feels awesome, I'm going to do that. And it's a sound that to me, I'm like, oh, we could make it. They get to decide that. They get to decide, this is what I want to, this is my goal, my timbral goal is this kind of sound, and this is how it feels, and this is how I like it. And to a certain extent, like, every person has that autonomy and should be allowed to do that. And of course, sometimes people say to me, well, there are disabled people who can't sing or who can't use their voices. And I say, yeah, that's true. And will everybody become an opera singer? No. Not all able-bodied people can become opera singers.
No, and that's my point. And that was what Bonnie and I talked about. Your able-bodied people might fall too.
Oh yeah.
So let us try.
Well, and I've heard some things recently. Sorry, I know we're coming up on the time, but I've heard some things recently about disabled singers applying for grad programs or other programs, and there being some concerns among faculty about well, can they get a job after? Like, what are they going to do? What if they can't demonstrate when they're teaching? What if they can't do? And I thought, nope. When I went to grad school, nobody asked that question. Like, nobody looked at me and said, well, but what if you can't get a job afterwards? And like, in this economy, nobody's getting jobs. It's very difficult to get jobs. Nobody ever worried about whether I or most of my colleagues were gonna have opera careers. I don't have an opera career, and I am able-bodied, and have had every opportunity to pursue this education, and it didn't go that way for me, and nobody ever wanted to keep me out because I might not have an opera career one day. Like, you just don't know. You just don't know, and everyone should have the opportunity to get there if that's where they're going.
There's the balance too, in our education climate, especially in higher education, of making sure that we are protecting kind of the usability of our degree program with our students. So there's a balance between, saying, is this something that this person's going to be able to, is this degree something that we're going to be able to use? And then are we only applying this to certain students and not to all students?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I think that's really important. The all students.
Yeah, that's something we do when we're doing teacher educator programs is we look at their dispositions and professional attitudes. And there are some students that I have to look at very closely to say, is this student going to actually be able to get a teaching job? And but that's not based on disability. And we certainly would let them try.
Yeah. And I think in this instance too, it was less about can they get a job and more about can they do it? Like what if I think it was someone who had hypermobility, Ehlers-Danlos, and so struggled to play the piano because of double jointedness. And I think one of the questions that I heard from a colleague was, not from one of my colleagues, but from one of my former colleagues who was having this issue at their university. But one of the questions was like, well, what if she can't play the piano when she's teaching? And I thought, there are so many ways. I know so many people who are not great pianists who teach great voice lessons. There are so many ways. There are recordings. There are, and you just need to adapt and maybe do something different. But just because you can't physically do the thing in the way that it's usually done doesn't mean you're not going to be a great voice teacher,
And you brought up earlier Thomas Quastoff. Mm-hmm. And he was actually denied a conservatory education because he couldn't do piano proficiency. And I love the fact that he went on to record those Schubert Lieder cycle with his finger in the air. I would hate to be the person who decided that Thomas Quastoff couldn't go to my school.
Right. That person at some point must have just been like...
And not to take away from piano proficiency, it is a foundation of our music education for a reason. But there are certain situations, where we probably could do something else.
Right. I really, there's so much creativity out there. There are so many different ways to do things. I've also taught voice lessons with no piano, like out of necessity. A couple of times. I had a student who had to take lessons from her car, and I had a keyboard, but she didn't, and it didn't impact the quality of the education. I hope. I don't think it did.
When I taught elementary school, I did some Dalcroze kind of situated lessons, but I used recorded music instead of the piano. And at that time I had 2 usable hands and I was piano proficient up to here, but what I wanted to do was here. So I just used the recorded music and we did Dalcroze movement. And of course now I can't, so I would have to use recorded music. But I think that I would still be able to kind of use a Dalcroze approach effectively as a teacher.
Sure. I use tracks all the time. I'm not a strong enough pianist to play most of the things that my students want to do, except like very slow Schubert. A student brought me a very slow Schubert song recently, and I was like, yes, my moment has come. I have a couple of those where I'm just, anytime they come up, I'm like, and I assign them sometimes too, where I'm like, I just want to make music.
I know this one. Yeah.
I can play this one. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, with, like I said, without taking anything away from piano proficiency, there are moments when that might not be the most important thing going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree.
All right. Well, we are running up on our time. Any final thoughts?
Oh, gosh. No. This has been an amazing conversation, and I have so much to continue to think about. My dissertation will be on ProQuest dissertations at some point soon. I just submitted like the official PDF copy. Hopefully that's good. Or it'll be on like the IU dissertation database somewhere. So once it is, I will share that with you, and you can link to it. Once it's out there, I can also you can link to a PDF and people can read it, because I'm happy to share.
And I'm so pleased. When I went to the OMI conference in March, I knew 4 people in the world. And when I got there, I met so many. And now, even on my list, and just in the US, we have, I think, 7.
Yes.
And I already know 3 or 4 more who are supposed to fill it out who haven't yet.
Ooh, they need to get on that.
But yeah, it's kind of, once you know it exists, there are people doing this work. But it's all being done kind of in niche corners.
Yep, absolutely. I think we got to make it more mainstream.
Yeah, I'm excited to start shining a light on things. I like it when other people do the work and I just push the light.
Excellent. Yes, and I'm so excited to be a fellow Georgian with you, and
it's going to be hot.
I know. I'm really excited about it. It's been cold here for so long.
Well, this brings us to the end of our episode. Thank you, Dr. Slobin, for joining us to discuss accessible vocal instruction. We hope you feel inspired, equipped, and ready to work with the disabled musicians in your community.
This podcast was created by Dr. Tina Holmes Davis. It was recorded by Tina Holmes Davis and edited by Brent McDonald. More Able Than Dis is a product of the Center for Music Education at Georgia College. For more information, check out www.gcsu.edu or follow us on Instagram. Music for this podcast provided by Brent McDonald.